Last time we spoke, the Europeans licked their wounds after a very nasty defeat to the Daku forts. Lord Elgin returned to China, and an even larger coalition force now set itself on a warpath to march upon Beijing. But this time they went around the Daku forts. They seized Kowloon, Chusan, Shanghai, Beitan, Tianjin, Dangu, and then they exacted their revenge upon the Daku forts. The key to their success was the devastating Armstrong field gun, which ripped asunder anything the Qing threw at them. Prince Zheng lost the battle for Jiang Jiawan, utterly humiliating the Qing. But the great general did not simply call it quits. For now, he reorganized his forces and put together a last stand, which would take place at Balicao. Could Prince Zheng stop the European menace before they got to Beijing? Only time will tell. This episode is part 6 of the Second Opium War, the burning of the Summer Palace. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we can begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and much, much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, where I've covered both Opium Wars and the Taiping Rebellion, and I'm currently releasing a 7-part series on China's warlord era. Check it out, it meant a lot to me. Prince Zheng and Prince Sung Bao, the brother of Emperor Xianfeng, had gathered a force of the Green Standard Army, reinforced by Imperial Guards of the 8th Banner Army, for a combined force nearly 3,000 men strong. After their victory at Jiang Jiawan, both Grant and Montauban were overly confident that they could simply march upon Beijing. As they marched, the 101st Regiment led by General Xiamin arrived to increase their numbers. On the morning of September the 21st, as the European columns moved past Tongzhou, they saw a Qing force in position in front of the Balicao bridges. The Qing force was formidable, with its left on the canal reinforced by the village of Balicao, another village in the center, and a third on the far right. The road to Beijing passed through a rolling wooden terrain, veering towards the canal and the Balicao bridges. Prince Zheng had re-established order to his army, and he strengthened their resolve by bringing up 100 guns, and he positioned them in the villages, on the other sides of the canal and along the entire front. The Green Standard Army were the majority, while the 8th Banner Army units were kept in reserve at the bridges. Zheng also had, of course, a large cavalry force, which was led by Sung Bao on their formation flanks. General Grant kept in line with what he had done in previous battles. He took the left while Montauban took the center and the right to protect his flank. General Montauban used the wooden terrain to hide his lack of numbers, sending the first column to hit the Qing center. General Xiamin moved to Coligny's right to hit the Qing left flank. Grant moved to the far left of Coligny, hoping to flank the Qing as well. General Coligny took the advance guard consisting of the elite companies of the 101st and the 12th Regiments, 2 companies of the 2nd Chasseurs à Pied, an engineer detachment, 2 batteries of horse artillery, and a battery of 4-pound foot artillery. Montauban and Xiamin commanded the 101st Regiment, along with the 2nd Chasseurs à Pied, a battery of 12-pounders, and a Congreve rocket section. Coligny's infantry sped through the woods towards the Qing center, and their speed shocked Sung Bao as he moved most of the cavalry from the wings to protect the center. The French advance guard moved into skirmish order, forming a long line towards Balicao. Montauban ordered Xiamin to go forward as 2 large bodies of Qing cavalry, around 12,000, charged at each of the French columns. Coligny's artillery rained hell into the Mongol and Manchu cavalry, while the elite company's riflemen fired from secure locations along the sides of the main road. The accurate rifle fire took a massive toll on the cavalry, but Colonel soon found himself embroiled in hand-to-hand combat. Montauban and Jamin also used their artillery to devastating effect, while the infantry formed two squares before the cavalry hit their position. The French 12-pound battery was positioned between Colonel and Jamin, continuously shelling the enemy. After some time, the Qing cavalry broke off their attack, having failed to break the French square formations, or to overrun Colonel's men. A brief lull allowed Montauban to reform and advance upon the villages being defended by the Green Standard battalions. Prince Sung Bao and Seng did not renew their cavalry assaults, because General Grant's column was marching right into their right flank. The 101st stormed into the village of Youguoyi in the center, scattering the defenders within each and suffering little casualties from the enemy's artillery. Montauban followed this up by sending both brigades to march upon the village of Baliciao. Colonel advanced along a road with his elite companies firing upon Qing forces trying to hold the roads towards the village. Large cannons in the streets and across the canal fired upon the French columns, but Jamin brought up his batteries to fire upon the cannons, easily overwhelming them. The village and bridge of Baliciao were defended by the 8th Banner Army units, and they did not falter nor give any ground. Colonel brought up his artillery to form a crossfire with Jamin's batteries, slaughtering the 8th Bannermen. Colonel then formed up his forces into a column and stormed the village. Fighting raged on at close quarters for 30 minutes as Montauban led the 101st to Colonel's support to secure the village. Suddenly, a Qing messenger was sent from Sung Bao to Montauban proclaiming that they had two captured colleagues of theirs, the French cleric Abbé Dulic and the British captain Brébazon of the Royal Artillery on one of the bridges, and that they would execute both men if the Europeans did not halt their attack. Without a single pause, Montauban pressed the attack. Colonel then reformed his command and rapidly advanced upon the bridge with the French batteries pounding cover fire. Most of the Qing artillerymen were killed by the European artillery, and with them gone, the rest of the 8th Banner Army were forced to cede ground and the bridge was soon overwhelmed. The French bayonet charged across the bridge, and Qing troops leapt into the canal for their lives. Prince Sung Bao made good on his threat, and he had Dulic and Brébazon executed and tossed over into the canal. The bridge was now in French hands. Grant's column dislodged the Green Standard troops from their village, while the British and Indian cavalry rolled up the line, overwhelming the Qing cavalry, trying to hold their ground. Grant's line of attack brought him within sight of the bridge that crossed the canal 1 mile west of Baliciao. The arrival of the British on Seng's right flank collapsed his forces in the face of their attack, and Seng was compelled to pull his army from the field before being trapped on the wrong side of the bridge. The French claimed 3 dead, 18 wounded. The British 2 dead and 29 wounded, while the Qing had up to a possible 1,500 casualties, if it is to be believed. The shocking triumph prompted Napoleon III to ennoble de Montauban, who would choose his place of victory for his new aristocratic title, Comte de Baliciao, joining the list of name-placing conquerors such as Scipio Africanus, the Duke of Marlborough, or Germanicus. Over on the other Baliciao bridge, General Hope was not enjoying the same easygoing time the French had had. Grant thought a horde of Mongol cavalry in the distance were the French, and he didn't open fire. The Mongols mistook this to mean Grant's men were cowards, and they charged upon them. When the British finally realized it was the enemy, they opened fire at close range and blew the Mongolians to pieces with their Armstrong field guns. Tongzhou surrendered without a fight, but still suffered the same fate as Jiangjiawan. They plundered the town, and General Grant had 3 rapists flogged with 100 strokes by the cat of 9 tails, then hung one of the men. But all 3 of said rapists happened to be Chinese coolies, based off of British reports, mind you. The British claimed that many of the rapes also came at the hands of the Sikhs, but again, these sources always seem to wash away the British and French from any bad stuff. Oh, and the British and French placed blame at one another, of course. One French soldier said of the plunder at Beijing, "Quand un Anglais se sont humettes, on ne trouve pas inclus où ils ont passé." As for the English, they are superiors when it comes to looting. You can't find a nail where they have passed. In the sources I've been reading, there's actually a lot of trash talk from the French. It's quite funny. Perhaps I should have checked out to see if there was any good French sources on the Second Opium War. Anyways, Prince Seng panicked after the last two obstacles to Beijing had fallen, Tongzhou and Jiangjiawan. Beijing's only remaining defense were its thick walls, at 40 feet high and 60 feet thick, bristling with towers and house defenders armed with more antiquated guns, bows and arrows, and spears. Both Elgin and Gros pleaded with the military forces to hurry to Beijing as they feared the hostages might be massacred if they delayed. But General Grant refused to budge until all of his heavy siege guns were shipped upriver from Tianjin to support their march on the great city. Elgin and Gros's fears were not unplaced. Emperor Xianfang had fled Beijing to go to Rehe, leaving his brother Prince Gong behind with orders to dig in and fight. Best emperor ever. Prince Gong was 28 years old and a much more capable sibling. The European force made its way to Beijing, where Elgin sent word to Prince Gong they refused to negotiate with him until all the hostages were freed. But they also helped him save face by allowing him to blame the hostage-taking on his subordinates. Prince Gong was not moved by the gesture, however, and he sent word to withdraw from Beijing, and only then the prisoners would be released. If they began an assault on the city, the prisoners would all be beheaded. On October the 6th, the artillery needed to blast a hole in Beijing's walls arrived. Prince Gong's position was, well, quite frankly, really bad. On top of literally being ditched by the said emperor, most of the army had left with him as well. On the 5th, Parks and Locke were told their execution would take place the next morning, and both prisoners were given papers and pens to write their last will and testament. But by now the captives were far too important as political pawns to simply be wasted upon with execution. On the 7th, the prisoners all heard the sound of gunfire and presumed the Europeans were bombarding the city, meaning they were all going to die very soon. They were all actually mistaken. The British were just firing their guns in the air to let the French know their position because they were spreading out. On October the 6th, the British and French had agreed to march around the Grand City from opposite directions and to meet at the Summer Palace, just outside the walls of Beijing. The two armies quickly lost contact with one another. The French reached the Summer Palace first, finding out that its occupant, Emperor Xianfeng, had fled with his 13 wives, a mere fraction of his harem. The French had expected the Emperor's personal guard to defend the Summer Palace to the death, but everyone had fled. The only resistance they faced was 500 unarmed court eunuchs who began screaming at them, "Don't commit sacrilege! Don't come within the sacred precincts!" The French shot 20 of them on the spot, sending the rest fleeing for their lives. The Summer Palace, or as the Chinese called it, Yuan Ming Yuan, the Gardens of Perfect Brightness, simply does not embody how grand it truly was. A more accurate term would have been Summer Palaces, since it was a complex of 200 main building sets, in a 80-square-mile park dotted with vermilion tents, artificial lakes, and exquisite gardens. The interiors were all unique. For example, one was a barricade audience chamber designed by Jesuit missionaries in the 17th century. There was also 2 other barricade palaces with golden roofs that was designed by the same Jesuit priests. Emperor Xianfang had spent countless days on the lakes staging mock naval battles with miniature boats representing the Qing Navy and the British. And of course, the emperor always won the naval battles. The Summer Palace was not just an architectural marvel, it was a national treasure, a storehouse of centuries of tribute the emperors of China had received from foreign barbarians. De Montauban realized what a historical treasure was now laying in his possession, and he tried to preserve the palace by telling his senior staff this. He counted on their honor to respect the palace and to see that it was respected by others, until the English arrived. But the sheer temptation of the priceless artifacts which lay littered across the palace floors proved an impossible temptation for the French. De Montauban's orders to not touch the treasures quickly fell apart. The French soldiers could not resist helping themselves to Ali Baba's worth of loot. Later on, in 1874, de Montauban would find himself before a government committee set up to investigate the looting of the palace. The general lied to his examiners, saying the French soldiers did not participate in the looting. I had sentries posted and directed 2 officers with 2 companies of marine infantry to protect the palace from the depredation and to allow nothing to be moved until the arrival of the English commanders. Thus there would be no pillage. Nothing had been touched in the palace when the English arrived. General Hope contradicted this testimony with eyewitness accounts. It was pitiful to see the way in which everything was robbed. Only one room in the palace was untouched. General de Montauban informed me he had reserved any valuables it might contain for equal division between the English and the French. General Grant's critique of de Montauban not being able to control his troops is a bit hypocritical, as he himself cannot control his men. Despite apparently similar orders from Grant, the British soldiers found a cornucopia of loot to be had. Jewels lay scattered all over the palaces. One French officer snatched a pearl necklace whose gems were the size of marbles, and he sold it in Hong Kong for £3,000. De Montauban realized he was fighting against the impossible, so he just let his men take home souvenirs, as he said it. 1 prize per soldier. Sure. It said when the French left the palace at 10 p.m., their pockets bulged with stolen treasure. When the British infantry arrived on October the 7th, they saw French tents piled high with jewels and other plunder. Some French soldiers were casually walking around wearing jewels worth millions of francs. Both generals simply gave up trying to establish any order, and by October the 8th, Grant demanded de Montauban split the gold bars found in the palace 50-50 with the British. Grant tried to restore some order by ordering his men to render their plunder up for a public auction. The money did not go to charity. One British major turned in £8,000 worth of gold ingots alone. The auction listed countless Chinese pieces of art, artifacts, sculptures of gold and silver, thousands of bolts of imperial yellow silk, and the list could go on forever. The 3-day auction netted around £100,000, 1/3 of which went to the officers and the other 2/3 to the NCOs. A private received £17, an officer £50. The French simply let their men keep whatever they had stolen. It was rumored that Baron Rothschild had an outstanding order with one French officer to buy anything he could at whatever price. There's probably a great conspiracy theory there. De Montauban tried to mollify a conscience-stricken General Grant by offering him a pair of gold and jade scepters as a gift for Queen Victoria. The other half was going to Napoleon III. Now, the European armies did not show up to Beijing with baggage carts, but they soon managed to commandeer 300 local carriages to whisk off their treasure. When Elgin arrived to Beijing on October the 7th, he was mortified by the looting of the Summer Palace. On October the 8th, Hung Chi, an imperial commissioner assigned to treat with the invaders, visited Locke and Parks. He treated them with respect. He also fed them lies, like how the emperor had a secret army of hundreds of thousands of men in Mongolia waiting to rescue the capital. He also tried pressing them the fact that trade between their nations might fall apart if the Europeans attacked. Then Hung Chi delivered to them a request from Prince Gong that they should write a letter to Elgin urging him to end the hostilities. Parks declined to help, even though Hung Chi said he might be executed if the men did not write the letter. Then Parks stated this: "Although you would do the Allied forces but little injury by killing the few prisoners, you would by such an act bring down on yourselves a terrible vengeance." Hung Chi then began to switch back to being a good cop, and he said this: "You will be in no danger for the next 2 or 3 days." Back on September the 29th, Locke and Parks had been transferred to the Gaomiao Temple in northern Beijing, where their treatment took a 180. They were wined and dined at a 48-course meal banquet catered by a restaurant near the temple. The men were too ill to eat, but happily accepted a bath in new clothes. Parks eventually wrote to Elgin, "The Chinese authorities are now treating Locke and myself quite well. We are told that His Highness, Prince Gong, is a man of decision and great intelligence. and I trust that under these circumstances, hostilities may be temporarily suspended to give opportunity for negotiation. Now, at the bottom of said letter, Locke added in Hudistani that he was writing under duress and believed the Qing could not decipher the Hindu language. Elgin was very happy to receive the letter, but worried the hostages would soon be executed. Elgin was in a real pickle. He felt as trapped as the hostages. If he ordered the siege to commence, the hostages would probably be killed. On October the 8th, orders arrived from Prince Gong to release the prisoners, however. The reason Prince Gong did this was actually because orders were coming in from Emperor Xianfeng to execute them all in revenge for plundering the Summer Palace. Locke and Parkes were released first, and it seems just their release alleviated Elgin and Gros' stress to such an extent that they did not seem to care about the fate of the other 30 to 40 hostages still in the Qing hands. Less than 24 hours after Locke and Parkes were released to the Allies on October the 9th, the Allies positioned 13 pieces of artillery opposite of the Antung Gate, and they began to dig trenches and posted a placard threatening bombardment if the gate did not open. Elgin gave the Qing until noon of October the 24th to open the gates to the city or the shelling would commence. And on October the 24th, 5 minutes before noon, the gate of Antung cracked open, a bit hesitatingly, then swung wide open. Without firing a single shot, Elgin marched at the head of 500 men into Beijing as conquerors. Now, the return of the remaining prisoners was not done promptly. 3 days after the Antung Gate opened, a Frenchman and 8 Sikhs were freed. 2 days later, 2 more Sikhs were freed. Both men were almost dead, and one did die the next day. In all, 19 prisoners were freed. 10 others had died, being forced to kneel in the courtyard of the Summer Palace for days without food or water, with their hands bound by moistened ropes and leather straps that shrank, causing them excruciating pain. The British and French found coffins with the bodies of the victims, one including the Times correspondent Thomas Bowlby. Many of the freed prisoners described their plight. They said that they had been bound with ropes or chains for days, exposed to the elements. Many got gangrene, and their infections took their lives. The Sikh and British victims were interred in a Russian cemetery on October the 17th without ceremony. The next day, the French held an elaborate funeral and a high mass for all the deaths. The fate of the prisoners seems to have pushed Elgin over the edge. He rattled his brain for a response to such a heinous crime. Elgin plotted a bloodless revenge in his mind, something to restore British honor through a symbolic act that would prevent the Qing from ever harming a contingent of European ambassadors to Beijing in the future. Elgin thought of a way to hurt the Chinese, but not at the cost of any lives. He sought to burn down the Summer Palace, a place where many of the prisoners were tortured to death. Elgin wrote to his wife about the decision, that in his mind it was to hurt the emperor's home, but to spare the common Chinese people. Jack Beeching had a rather interesting thing to say about Elgin's decision. Elgin's decision to burn the Summer Palace at least meant that flesh and blood injuries done to the people he knew intimately would be once revenged. Not as in war, upon another people, on helpless Chinese, but on inanimate objects, on redundant and expensive things. He had suffered all his life from his father's costly obsession with works of art. Now works of art would bear the brunt of his revenge. Thus Elgin's father had profited from the plunder of art, and now Elgin was going to destroy art. Elgin also had pressing concerns. He faced a deadline imposed upon him by General Grant, who warned him that a treaty must be concluded before Beijing's winter set in, so the Allies could return safely to their base of operations at Tianjin. If they did not, Grant warned Elgin that their supply lines would be overextended and they would easily be severed off by Qing forces. Prince Sang had been defeated, but his cavalry remained a constant threat and they could blockade the city at any given time. D-Day for burning of the Summer Palace was set for October the 18th. And one 27-year-old captain in the Royal Engineers said this of the event. "We went out, and after pillaging it, burned the whole place, destroying in a vandal-like manner most valuable property which could not be replaced for 4 millions. We got upward of 48 apiece prize money. I had done quite well. The local people are very civil, but I think the grandees hate us, as they must after what we did to the palace. You can scarcely imagine the beauty and the magnificence of the places that we burnt. It made one's heart sore to burn them. In fact, these places were so large, and we were so pressed for time, we could not plunder them carefully. Quantity of gold ornaments were burnt, considered as brass. It was wretchedly demoralizing work for an army. They destroyed the 800-acre complex of buildings and gardens where countless Chinese emperors had spent so much of their time. There were so many ornate buildings on the grounds covering more than a square mile that it took 2 full days of burning, breaking, and smashing to bring it all down. Countless books, artifacts, centuries of history burned to ashes. Some would compare it to the burning of the Library of Alexandria. If you believe it burnt down, that is. Sorry, I happen to be a fan of a podcast called Our Fake History, and he covered that subject, and it turns out there's a lot of misconceptions about that. Regardless, it remains a tragedy, and the remains of the old summer palace stand today as a monument of what once stood. China is still trying to have the site placed on the list of UNESCO World Heritage Sites. I would be remiss to not say something here. I have covered this subject, the burning of the Summer Palace, on my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, and I have covered it here in this podcast. And each time I have written about how horrendous it was and how humiliating it was for the Chinese. But a week ago, I was on a podcast many of you might know about. It's kind of a side project called Questioning History. To summarize, it's a YouTube channel where myself and some colleagues interview and debate other YouTubers who do history. So you have History Dose has been on an episode, Emperor Tiger Star, my personal favorite on YouTube, Alternate History Hub, love Cody. And anyways, last week we had Cool History Bros. He covers ancient and Middle Ages Asian history, basically. And we had one debate that touched upon the burning of the Summer Palace. And he said something that I found very interesting. While the burning of the Summer Palace can be seen as a great tragedy for all the lost items, they were items. Not just that, they were exclusively the property of the monarchs of China, the elite, the super wealthy. The common people of China probably had never seen the Summer Palace, and this meant absolutely nothing to them. Thus, it's kind of changed my mind a little bit about Elgin's rationale. It really was a direct attack upon the emperors themselves, sparing the common Chinese people. Not to say it wasn't a horrible act, and not to forgive it in any way, a lot of history was lost that day. Anyways, that's enough for this rant, so I'll get back on to the story. On October the 23rd, the Qing Imperial Treasury paid in full the increased indemnity fee of 500,000 taels to Britain and France. On October the 24th, Elgin met with Prince Gong at the Board of Ceremonies to sign the new Treaty of Peking. By this point, Elgin had become a student of Qing court protocols, and he used this knowledge to further humiliate Prince Gong and the court officials by arriving at the board in a chair, carried by 8 porters. You see, according to tradition, only the emperor had the right to so many porters. Now Elgin had learnt he was the target of assassination, so he showed up also with 500 troops, and he dispatched another 2,000 troops to perform a triumph tour of Beijing. Lieutenant Colonel Wolseley also performed a minesweep of the meeting room before Elgin went in. God, can you imagine if they put mines in the meeting room? That would be crazy. Elgin also ordered a huge piece of artillery to be mounted on the Antung Gate aimed directly at the city to ensure good behavior from the population. Prince Gong arrived to the board in a sedan chair borne by 6 porters, something prescribed for his rank, and when he saw Elgin had 8, he knew immediately it was a direct insult towards his brother. Elgin also made sure to show up 2 hours late. The signing of the new treaty took on sort of a comedy. Elgin scared the hell out of the court officials when he screamed at them, "Keep perfectly still." This was because his Italian photographer, Signor Beto, was taking a shot of the scene to preserve the Chinese humiliation. Bad lighting doomed the Italians' efforts, and no photographic evidence of the signing was made available to the British press. By the way, on the note of photography, the Second Opium War is one of the first instances you actually get to see actual photos of some of the events. Over on my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, sorry I'm shameless, I have a rather long 45-minute episode on the First Opium War and another one on the Second Opium War. Now, my episode on the second one utilizes a lot of the actual photos taken, and it's incredible. They're really worthwhile to Google, especially the photographs just outside of Beijing and the Daku forts. So, stating that, I hope you check out such photos because they really give a feeling to all the events, and please check out my episode, it would mean a lot to me. So again, the Qing were given a document to sign, not a treaty to negotiate, when Elgin presented the treaty to Prince Gong for a signature. The convention included an apology for the emperor's aggression. The British ambassador was granted a year-round residency, and 10 million in reparations were being paid to the British. Another port city was added to the list of those that would be open to trade, and Kowloon would be handed over to Britain. After signing and being degraded, Prince Gong invited Elgin to a banquet in his honor, and Elgin declined, citing his fear that the Qing would simply poison him. That is a sly remark. The French version of the same treaty occurred the next day, and Baron Gros was much more gracious. After the signing of the treaty, Gros gave Gong a rare collection of French coins and an autographed photo of Napoleon III and the Empress Eugenie. Gros apologized for the burning of the Summer Palace, but did not mention all of the looting. Gros then accepted Prince Gong's invitation to dinner, and he was not poisoned. In December, Elgin spent his time recuperating in Shanghai, reading Victorian romance novels and Darwin's recent bestseller, On the Origin of Species, which Elgin found to be audacious, in his own words. In January, he left China for good, as Britain began the process for annexing Kowloon. Elgin returned to Britain a hero, and he received the new appointment as Viceroyalty of India, a position Lord Canning fought to get him. As the Viceroy, Elgin enjoyed the lucrative post for 20 months. But then he died of an aneurysm in November of 1864 in Calcutta, the same city Canton's Viceroy, Yi Mingchen, died. Perhaps a symbolic symmetry. Emperor Xianfeng died at 30 years of age, only a year after signing the Convention of Peking, which had humiliated him so much, he secluded himself and spent his days smoking opium, drinking wine, and, of course, getting into bed with his harem, never leaving Rehe. Emperor Xianfeng never returned to Beijing, and he refused to meet with foreign ambassadors or even his own courtiers. So deep, it was said, of his shame. Prince Seng, the de facto commander-in-chief of the Qing military, continued to suffer military setbacks and humiliations. At one point, he led 23,000 infantry and cavalry to quell a violent tax revolt in Shandong province, and there he was forced to beg European occupiers to return some of his guns he had surrendered to them during the Second Opium War. And that is very embarrassing. Well, they ignored his pleas, and the prince ended up failing to suppress the rebellion. Queen Victoria had received one very interesting gift from the Summer Palace, a small Pekingese dog that she named Ludi. The poor thing had been found wandering around the ruins of the Summer Palace, where a captain in a Worcestershire regiment rescued it and gave it to the queen. The queen also, of course, received a jade and gold scepter from General Hope. Both the First and Second Opium Wars were fought largely because of the opium trade and British manufacturers. The conflict was an incredible payoff for Britain. 4 years after the Second Opium War ended, Britain sold China 7/8 of all the conquered nation's imports, more than 100,000 pounds annually. Opium imports to China increased from 58,000 chests in 1859 to 105,000 chests in 1879. The British textiles, which the Chinese rejected for their own silk, eventually found a market, quadrupling from 113 million yards in 1856 to 448 million yards 25 years later. The Treaty of Tianjin basically made opium legal in China by setting the amount at which the Qing taxed it. The Qing court tried to fight the importation of opium by raising taxes on it. There were many attempts by officials in Britain to stop the opium trade, but it was far too profitable, and those vices were quelled whenever they rose up. Eventually, the Qing realized they could not stop the plague that was opium addiction, so they began to cultivate opium in large quantities within China, to at least offset the British imports. Opium addiction became more and more rampant in China. In 1906, the Qing government forbid the sale of opium, but users over the age of 60 were exempted for a very specific reason. Empress Dowager Cixi was an opium addict herself. Opium cultivation and consumption thrived well into the 1920s and 1930s under Chiang Kai-shek's government. By the time of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937, 4 million Chinese, around 10% of the population, were opium addicts. Over in British-held Hong Kong, 30% of the colony's population were dependent on opium. During the war with Japan, the Japanese occupiers encouraged opium consumption to make the population more docile. Within a single year of the communist takeover under Mao Zedong, dealers of opium were executed. Some lucky ones got to go to the gulags. Users were treated more humanely and detoxed in hospitals. But needless to say, opium did untold horrible damage to China, and it remains a fundamental part of the century of humiliation. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all of that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, where I've covered both Opium Wars and the Taiping Rebellion. Give it a look, it would mean a lot to me. The Chinese struggled for 150 years against opium. More than half a century of legislation by both Britain and China failed, while Mao Zedong's totalitarian efficiency succeeded in half a generation's time. Ironically, Mao Zedong enforced a policy and a plan that had first been tried by a certain commissioner named Lin Zexu. Go figure.